Hi, my name is Eric, and this is a presentation on photography for birders and other wildlife enthusiasts. Chapter 3, Part 1. This is about light. There are 4 ways you can alter light. You can change the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO, or you can add flash. The aperture is built into the lens of the camera. It is controlled using either the aperture ring on the lens itself or through the command dial on the camera. It's controlled by stops. Each click is usually a third of a stop. A low F number gives you less depth of field but lets in lots of light. A high F number gives you lots of depth of field but very little light. This was shot at F4, and you can notice the background is quite blurry. Even at F11, which on a wide angle lens would give you lots of depth of field, because this is a telephoto, even at F11 there's very little depth of field, although you still get more than you would otherwise. To get the very best shutter speed, it's a good idea to follow some of these steps. Make sure your mode dial is set to aperture priority. Once you do that, choose the lowest aperture you can. So once you've done those 2 things, now you have to pay attention to your shutter speed. Now I want you to understand that this is a really large area here. The shutter speed that you need to use is going to be highly dependent upon quite a large number of things. Does the lens have vibration mitigation? Is it sharper at certain focal lengths? That's one of the things to think about. Apertures as well. Are you panning? Are you doing a still image? Are you going to use flash? There's a lot of considerations here. So is the shutter speed too slow? One of the key ideas here is you need to know your equipment. So the general idea is this, and this is an important concept. The slowest shutter speed to do the job well without making the ISO too high. In aperture priority, you choose the lowest aperture. That'll give you the fastest shutter speed. And if it's not fast enough, then you need to bump up your ISO until you get a new shutter speed. Every time you double the ISO, you double the shutter speed. And you need to keep doing this, increasing ISO, checking shutter speed until you get the right combination. Press play, zoom in when you press play, make sure the detail is good, and if you're happy, then go on. Even at 1/400th of a second, which seems like a very fast shutter speed, it cannot be fast enough. That's another problem when you have vibration mitigation on and you're panning. Slow shutter speed, 1/80th of a second, that can work great for certain circumstances, but in this case it's just not fast enough. Sometimes a 50th of a second is plenty fast, even though we're shooting here at 250 millimeters, so 375 relative. But with vibration mitigation turned on and the creature not moving a lot, there's no panning going on, so it works. So there is no one shutter speed that works. There is no one rule of thumb in terms of shutter speed. There is a variety of factors to consider, and that's one of the tricky parts about doing photography with birds. Now take a look here at this. This is a rule based upon the minimum handheld shutter speed, which uses this formula called 1 over relative focal length. Notice that word relative. That's important. Okay, relative focal length basically means that it's the focal length based upon a full frame camera. So if you've got a let's say a APS-C sensor camera and it's around 200 millimeters, it'll be functioning at 300 millimeters relative. So you got to be able to multiply the actual focal length by the crop factor to give you the relative focal length. That's an important concept. If you don't have stabilization technology or it's turned off, the handheld shutter speed is going to be these values for these focal lengths. If you have vibration reduction, typically 1 stop is not a problem. 2 stops on some of the older vibration mitigation lenses is about all you could get. But modern today, you're usually getting between 3 and 4 stops. I quite like shooting about 3 stops. I find that's fairly reliable. And these are the shutter speeds. Now keep in mind that this isn't for panning and that this isn't for a creature that's moving. Okay, this is for something that's still. This is to keep the camera from vibrating. So if you don't have vibration mitigation and you're shooting at slower shutter speeds, even something here like 1/250th of a second, it's too slow for the amount of magnification that's going on. Here's 1/800th of a second. Given the amount of magnification, that's working out quite well. So if you have vibration mitigation, then you can use that 2 or 3 or 4 stop rule, and you can reduce your shutter speed by quite a bit. But you got to remember that is for a subject that's not moving. If you are panning, what you want to do is pay attention to some of the information, some of the functions on your camera. I like to pan. I find panning it does a very nice job of providing some very good photographs. I usually turn vibration mitigation off unless I have this thing called active vibration mitigation, which allows you to make it so that the vertical is mitigated but the horizontal is not, allowing you to pan. And so shutter speeds, I find somewhere between 1/100th and 1/200th of a second seems pretty good. Slower than that, too much risk of blur, and faster than that, you don't really get the benefit of panning for the background. If you're going to pan, consider using 3D focusing, also called focus tracking. Now, focus tracking is highly dependent upon the camera and the lens. Higher performing camera bodies are going to have faster tracking. They're going to have more focus zones. It's going to be able to jump around and find targets a lot faster. Better performing lens, internal focus or ultrasonic focus motors, for example, can perform well with the camera body, and I usually set my drive mode to continuous, so I'm shooting lots of frames per second. So slow shutter speed combined with not turning off VR, this is the kind of shot you're going to get. If you have decent shutter speeds, and this is 1/160th of a second, vibration mitigation turned off as I'm panning. And this was not the only shot. I took a lot of shots, and this is probably the best one. So you got to recognize that when you're panning, you're going to get a lot of shots that are garbage. But you are going to capture the odd one that is going to go, wow, that turned out very nicely. One of the reasons why using continuous drive mode is a good idea. We're going to talk a little bit about ISO, and then we're going to end this part, and we will do a second part. ISO is how sensitive the light is to light. ISO stands for International Standards Organization. Used to be called ASA, but we've done away with that a long time ago, and we use ISO now. Every time we double the ISO, we need one less stop of light, which means we can increase the shutter speed by a full stop. Very useful when you're looking at getting faster shutter speeds. Okay, high ISO value risks this thing called noise, electronic noise. It degrades the quality of the image, which means you can't enlarge it as much. It looks good small, but as soon as you start getting it bigger, it goes, oh, there's something wrong. Electronic noise increases with things like very long shutter speeds. Now we're talking 4 seconds, so it's not a problem with birding. But high ISO noise levels are important. Small sensors are important, and older equipment is important. So this is a series of shots I did 2 days ago, and I found a very cooperative towhee. So I went out and I took a number of photographs, and I changed the ISO, and then zoomed in, of course, to show you the result of this. And you can see that as ISO increases, the amount of noise increases. The detail, let's just go back and look at that again. The detail decreases as ISO increases. Now this was done on a bridge 1-inch sensor camera. So because it's a smaller sensor, there's a little more noise. On a full frame or even an APS-C, this wouldn't be quite this bad. But notice how the gradual changes in noise happens as ISO increases. I like to shoot lower ISO values, and again, keep this in mind. You keep the ISO as low as you can to get the best shutter speed you can, to have that good combination between no blur and little noise. And so you can see in this shot there's very little noise here as well. Okay, and in this one here, zooming in, you can see the noise level is pretty good. This is another dark-eyed junco shooting at spotted towhee, used to be called rufous-sided towhee, and it at an ISO 800 is starting to show a moderate amount of noise. This is a slightly older camera, so the technology isn't quite the same as it is today, but it really gives you a good idea of what's going on with noise. You can see here how there's just the pixels are all very strange, and when we zoom in on this spot, it's like, wow, look at that. So that's color noise. That's because there's such little light coming in that the sensor's having a hard time generating proper colors. So what's that relationship between ISO and shutter speed? So this is kind of the whole thing summed together. A fast shutter speed reduces blur from camera motion and subject motion. Low ISO improves quality of image, gives you reduced noise, especially in dark areas, and higher signal quality, a better signal to noise ratio. And so the trick then is to get the best of both worlds by choosing the fastest shutter speed you can without getting too high of an ISO. You want to pay attention to both those values, and when you do that, you're always going to end up with the best picture you can get for the moment. Okay, so we'll stop here and we will continue with this chapter in part 2.